Imagine the United States, a quilt stitched in patterns. Now imagine this quilt stitched with stories of the diverse racial groups of which it comprises. The stitching of the quilt is institutional structure that controls its stories. If we look carefully, we could see frayed stitching, a deeply racialized nation riddled with structural racism. Our nation is made up of stories, only some acknowledged. History is told from a European perspective, not from voices of oppressed groups. However, all stories need to be included in curriculum. For oppressed communities, teaching subjugated knowledge is political liberation. Transformative knowledge unearths bodies of historically subjugated accounts. The achievement gap is the pattern of underachievement among minority students. These disparities have been centuries in the making. While society blames minorities for underachievement, structural inequalities have been at work since the founding of this nation. Catching up is made nearly impossible by numerous structural barriers. Inequality shapes this nation. Black students have systematically been denied equal access to education. It was once illegal for blacks to read and attend schools. Further, schooling for blacks has historically been separate but unequal, and today many attend hyper-segregated schools. Inner city schools are underfunded. As African Americans are more likely to live in high crime, impoverished neighborhoods, there are not enough tax revenues to fund schools. The promises of desegregation by Brown v. Board of Education have failed due to white flight from urban schools. In the achievement gap, the law and criminal justice system are intertwined. It is important to examine the effect that policing and slavery have had on blacks. The impact has created a population that is racially profiled, feeds the prison system, high numbers of high school dropouts, teen parents, and children too scared to leave their homes to go to school, afraid of the police and their neighbors. To keep blacks marginalized, policing efforts are increased in poor black communities. The police marginalize and silence young black men with brutality. When communities resist, they are told their story is not true, that young black men choose to do stupid things and disobey the law. One must understand the history of policing to comprehend the achievement gap. Policing African Americans began in the South with slave patrols who chased down runaway slaves. Later, police departments formed to control free slaves who became agricultural workers. The police also enforced Jim Crow laws, institutionalizing economic, educational, and social disadvantages. Early police departments were corrupt and brutal. Besides controlling freed slaves, they were also involved in enforcing segregation, organized crime, election fraud, gambling, prostitution, drinking, and bribery. Promotions within police departments were bought and sold. They had carte blanche to use force. Few, if any, requirements were needed to be a police officer. Today's social reality of police work has been inherited from the past. This stigma goes back to the beginning of American policing. Over history, police have been represented with tyranny and repression and loathed and feared. Old attitudes of slavery have been permeated modern consciousness from family histories, literature, and the watching of Hollywood movies. Additionally, the ecological distribution of police work, where police are assigned to patrol, reflects prejudice. Certain geographic areas are considered suspicious areas. These areas are disadvantaged with large minority populations. Here, black males are considered symbolic assailants and will receive intense police scrutiny based on their social grouping. These neighborhoods are characterized by extreme racial segregation, as well as disproportionate rates of poverty, unemployment, and female headed families. Disproportionate policing occurs in disadvantaged communities. There are frequent surveillance and stops, less police protection, and slower response times to crimes and citizen requests. The cumulative effects of being hassled by the police with disproportionate policing strategies, aggressive policing strategies, and police brutality have affected the collective consciousness of black communities. Aggressive policing strategies in minority communities include police discretion, abuse of authority, stopping and questioning innocent people. Because of disproportionate policing, young black men have negative perceptions and experiences with the police and are cynical about the legal system. The negative perceptions of the black community towards the police have come from the many blacks who have been victims of racial profiling and the high rates of young black men who have been targeted and brutalized by the police. Young black men are resentful and angry. Police officers do not treat them with dignity and respect. They do not acknowledge their innocence when they do not find any evidence. Police officers use antagonistic language, curse and make derogatory comments to them, and tell them that they will never amount to anything. Police treat these young men as if they are not human and talk to them very badly. Young black men oppose the hegemony of the police. Sometimes subordinate groups cannot find the language to oppose oppression, a discourse of resistance. They have been banned from voicing opposition by economic and political constraints, and can act in ways that work against their own interests. In essence, they become accomplices in their own subordination. Young African Americans living in disadvantaged communities today are faced with reduced employment and educational opportunities and increased levels of poverty. They have experienced continuing discrimination, persistent police brutality, and toxic environmental pollution in their neighborhoods. This has created predictable crime related problems and low achievement in school. Given this context, how can the achievement gap be bridged? Latson Billings calls for reaching Black students through cultural vehicles and to know as much about the culture as possible. Knowing more about culture helps teachers plan relevant learning activities, increase communication with parents, and increase student success. To bridge the achievement gap and improve education, lived stories must be told. Stories function to create social and rhetorical spaces, which allow lived experiences to be expressed. Subjugated knowledge needs to be unearthed into transformational knowledge for a process of social and political liberation to begin. Race and racism must be talked about with youth who are experiencing its effects. The achievement gap of African American students is dire, though out of dire circumstances comes hope. African Americans are resilient. They have risen as a people to prominence around the world. They have defied the odds and risen from slave ancestors to modern day professionals. Educating these youth is not harder than slavery, yet educating them is critical for the fate of this nation.